know, no one was just keep talking. Hello, as our panel is getting mic'd, I want to go ahead and get ourselves started. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it and you're not afraid to show it, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Good. This is a great early care and education and 2-gen strategy. Get everybody quiet by clapping hands. Good afternoon. I'm Marjorie Sims. I'm the Managing Director at Ascend, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session, which is going to be so much brain candy, your bowl will be overflowing with brain candy. This is about polling and public will. Ascend at the Aspen Institute is committed to ensuring that the voices of families are included in this work, and we have a deep understanding of how the American public feels about these approaches and strategies. Over the last 5 years, we've conducted over 15 different focus groups across the country that has engaged, families to understand what their needs are, where they see opportunities. Those focus groups have been very diverse and very focused in a way to lift out the voices of single parents in particular and people of color. We've also conducted polling at the national level to understand how the American public and in particular voters feel about 2-generation strategies and approaches. And the good news is that this is such a popular, overwhelmingly popular approach that it's intuitive. It's almost intuitive to people. When you talk about this, they understand the importance of working with both children and parents together. So to ground us in this polling data and start a very rich and engaging conversation, we have two of the brightest minds in polling in the country. We will be hearing first from Celinda Lake, who is the founder and president of Lake Research. Celinda is an amazing person, just person in general. I've known her for many, many years and have deep respect for her. She's committed to these issues. She's a Democratic pollster, sought after all of the time, but she gives her time and talent to Ascend. And in fact, she took a red eye last night to be here with us this afternoon to share her knowledge and wisdom and the work that she's done commissioned by Ascend. And then secondly, we have with us Vince Breglio. He is also a very well-respected pollster. He's working with Republicans. He worked on the Bush Quail campaign, as well as the Reagan campaigns. He's also worked with Fortune 500 companies and foundations and others in the private sector and some nonprofit organizations. He brings his critical lens to the polling data that we've gathered, and so that we can have a rich conversation about how this really works on the ground and what messages people are hearing. If you have had the opportunity to look through your packet, this is the jammed pack packet that we provided for you. It has in it the top 10 for 2Gen, which is our policy ideas and principles around how you advance two-generation programs and policies, and then also messaging tips for how you can use the polling information that has been done by Celinda and her team and looked at by Vince to really shape messages on the ground when you're working with these programs, both at the local, state, and national level. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Celinda. She's going to do a presentation for about 15 minutes. We're going to hold tight to our timeline because what we know is that the conversation is really the rich part of this session. And then Vince will do his presentation, and then we'll engage in a question and answer so that you make certain that you walk away with all of the knowledge and the brain candy that I promised you. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Celinda. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you mind if I use the podium?
Absolutely, I'm happy to use the podium.
Might be more comfortable. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. Well, thank you so much. It's a delight to be here, and I really want to commend the tremendous work that Ascend does and all of the work that you all do. I've never been called brain candy before, though. I love that. I'm going to put that on my website. And it's always a deep honor. I have known Vince even longer than I have known Marjorie, and we have worked together. We obviously started in Head Start. We were the two little kids that went to poll in Head Start, and or kindergarten. And it is a great privilege, as always, to work with him. This data is very exciting. Because, now I'm going to stand in front of my own data, which isn't good, but this data is very exciting because it's going to confirm everything that you know in your heart. And it's going to prove everything that you hear on the Beltway is wrong, 110% plus or minus 5%. So this, I'm not going to say this is going to make your Hill visits any easier, or your state legislative visits any easier, but it is going to put you in a totally different frame of mind. So this is based, oh, great. I just want to make sure I wasn't standing in front of the data. Thank you. And I've got my copy here. Thank you so much, Marjorie. This is from a national survey of 1,005 adults, 18 years of age or older. The error on here is plus or minus 3%. And basically, the data is downright astounding. So the first thing we looked at was the two-generation approach. And what we found, as Marjorie said, is that it is very intuitive to people. In fact, it's more than intuitive, it's like a core value. So when we asked people, which do you think would be better, targeting parents, targeting children, or targeting both parents and children, 52% said targeting both parents and children. Notice, although we explicitly offered the option, we do not need any more programs. Only 19% of people said we do not need any more programs. This is a survey with over 40% Republicans. So even the less than half of conservatives believe that we don't need any more programs. The right program, they feel, is right for the times. For some reason, this isn't advancing. Thanks. I'm just going to have you advance for me. Thank you. So America very tax sensitive right now, and they're tax sensitive in part because their wages have been stuck for 20 years. They're tax sensitive because their home, which is their biggest sense of personal wealth, has declined in value. Maybe they lost it. Maybe it's eking back up. They're tax sensitive because their kids are back home on the couch. In fact, one of the people in our focus groups called them the boomerang kids. You send them out, they come back. You send them out, they come back. And in the last recession, 56% of children were back home on the couch at some point. And I see some heads nodding of people who may have had that personal experience. So when we asked people, we described a program to help people who are living in poverty get out of poverty, which targets both parents and their children, so parents get education, skills training to get a better job. At the same time, their children get a good start with Head Start, early education, quality schools. 89% said I favor that. 70% said I strongly favor that. It is beyond just a program. Popular programs are supported like 60, 65%. This is at the level of what we call a valence issue, which is, it's become a core value. It's become common sense to the public. We asked, would you favor this even if it increased your own taxes? And 70% of Americans said they favored it even if it increased their own taxes. And almost half of Americans said I still strongly favor it, even though I'm not too excited about increasing my own taxes. If we look at the next chart, you will see, you're looking for bipartisan cooperation and bipartisan agreement. Well, it exists in America. It just doesn't exist in the legislative halls of America. So everybody across the board wildly in favor of this program. And even when you say it will increase your taxes, notice 60% of independents and 57% of Republicans, a solid majority of both, say, yeah, I'm in favor of this. It makes sense. It's the kind of investment that makes sense. So next we looked at early childhood education. This is something that, if we look at the next chart, that people totally on board with. Everybody knows the 0 to 4 research. They've heard it. They know the difference at early childhood. They know that kindergarten is the new first grade. Any way you argue it, they want kids ready for school. They want them ready for school so that they can learn. Even conservative parents want kids ready for school so they don't disrupt their own kids, who they feel they got ready for school in the classroom. So we said, do you agree or disagree? If you want to make sure low-income children are successful in their early learning, then we have to also invest in their parents' economic well-being. So we expanded the agenda. 71% of the public said, yes, I agree with that, 52% strongly. Again, notice across the board, parents, non-parents, men and women, 84% of Democrats like this, 68% of independents, and a solid majority of Republicans as well. Across the board support. If we look at the next chart for this room, parents strongly agree that Head Start and early Head Start should partner to help parents. Now, first of all, people love Head Start and early Head Start, okay? So give yourself a round of applause. People love you. And even when we cite to them in other studies we've done, the studies show it's not effective. People think, well, there's something wrong with that study, because I know it's effective. I've seen it firsthand. People overwhelmingly love these programs. And just remember that every time you are given a bad time by a member of Congress or a state legislator, that your program is about 30 points more popular than they are. Now, that may not convince them very much, but it ought to give you some solace when you're arguing with those SOBs. So, but we took it beyond that, because we're looking at, I think, what was a central question that you all asked today, which is, everybody talks about this in the child piece. What happens? What's the rhetoric? How do we couple it with the parent piece? Turns out it's very intuitive to the public to couple it with the parent piece. So we said Head Start and Early Head Start are two federal programs that ensure access to quality early learning education for low-income children. Do you think these programs should partner with organizations that help parents of low-income children further their own education or receive job training? And people said, brilliant idea. 84% liked it, 67% liked it strongly. This is as popular now as 4th of July and apple pie, okay? You're at that level. If we look at the next chart, this was really surprising to us, because home visiting programs not as familiar to voters. And voters a little unclear, how do you take it to scale? How do you make this work? Can we really afford it? They have more questions about it than Head Start. Head Start, they would just dramatically expand if they could. It's like, yes, go. It's great. This stuff is a little less clear to people, and we talked about partnering these programs, again, with parent programs, and people were like overwhelmingly in favor of this. 88% in favor, 69% strongly in favor. And again, across the board, total bipartisanship, total across race, total across men and women. So it's interesting, in a time when everybody talks about polarized America, not on these issues they're not. On these issues, there's a consensus in America. You want a bipartisan issue? Here's your agenda. Part of what is very salient out there right now is reform. People want to change things. They want to make them better. And Americans always want to change things. There was some very interesting anthropological work that was done for commercial advertisers. And they interviewed Brits, Germans, and Americans. And I can't remember what the Brits said, but they said to the Germans, this beer's formula has been the same for 99 years. And the Germans said, it's obvious, it's Bavarian beer, it's the best in the world, same for 99 years. They said to the Americans, this beer has been the same formula for 99 years. Americans said, really? Well, give it to us, we'll make it better in 6 months. So Americans always want to change things, they always want to look at the other side of the mountain, they always want to improve things. And this agenda has the ability to capture some of that reform sentiment, which is very, very strong right now out there. So one of the things we tested was simplifying the application process so that one application can determine eligibility. People thought overwhelmingly, yeah, this is totally the right thing to be doing. People are also think that there are a lot of things that are arbitrary about the programs now, and these numbers have skyrocketed post-recession. So people have had more experience where I just made $100 more, or my sister made $100 more, and then she wasn't eligible for the program anymore, or she was ruled ineligible because she had this arbitrary. People really want these as sliding scale. They do not want these as arbitrary on and off limits or stair step the way these programs are structured. So we asked people, would you make people, let's turn to the next slide, I'm sorry. Would you make people parents enrolled in college or workforce training eligible for state-funded child care subsidies? So we're using a lot of keywords here that can bring down support. State-funded, well, nobody knows anybody in the state funding anything but themselves, so that says taxpayer. Subsidies, not a particularly great word out there, and has a lot of associations with welfare, frankly, for people, and yet overwhelming support. And you can see overwhelming bipartisan support as well. So again, people want to reform these programs. Next slide, oppose reducing or eliminating subsidies when a parent gets a raise. People said, I absolutely oppose eliminating or reducing when you get a raise. People, again, don't want to punish people for doing better, and they think there ought to be a better partnership here. Notice even Republicans, a solid majority of Republicans oppose subsidies being reduced or eliminated when a working low-income parent gets a raise. We also looked real quickly at an expanded agenda, and around all of these programs, education, and one of the challenges, of course, right now is America is in love with education. It may not seem that at the states, but America loves teachers, America loves Head Start, America loves all the things that are under attack. And they also think, unfortunately, that you can be the cure for everything. So you can fix the future, you can fix the economy, and you can cure cancer simultaneously. So if we looked first at post-secondary education, and we'll turn like 2 slides ahead to this next one, and you'll see here across the board support for a number of programs, including provide access for low-income students who have young children to career services and child development through school, extend the hours for career service, create partnerships with private sector, community colleges, and government to provide services for low-income students, include child care expenses in determining financial aid eligibility. People were flabbergasted that wasn't true now. Like, what else would you be doing? It's not exactly like you can tell those kids, okay, you just sit here till mommy finishes 4 years of college, and then I'll be back. Providing low-income students who have young children year-round access to financial aid, which people think is a big problem, and people think increasingly people are going year-round. So a very broad agenda of partnerships and reforms that real people think are just common sense. Notice these levels of support, and notice the levels of strong support. We think we've got a good policy when we have 2/3 of the voters who support something and 47 to 50% who strongly support it. Obviously, these policies are off the charts. Looking at the next thing, we looked at economic supports and human services. And we said, do you think people should be eligible only if they work at least 20 hours per week? Do you allow using workforce training and education program as part of the work requirement? And people said, sure. I mean, all of this stuff that you are bruised and battered and have, I'm sure you had bandages on your knuckles that you had to take off before you came to this meeting because of these fights. This is like, yeah? Like, what else should we be doing? This is like common sense to people. And again, it's common sense to everybody in America, except the people who sit in state legislatures and Congress, unfortunately. We looked at health and well-being. And while we didn't measure it, by the way, one thing that I know that you discussed that is very, very strong out there is mental health. It is testing off the charts right now. People are incredibly supportive of mental health services. More and more people have personal experience with it. People think the services are completely inadequate. A lot of these state legislatures went in and cut mental health services. And I will tell you, they did it because they thought they could get away with it. And actually, when we have been in state after state after state, when you talk about the least favorite cuts for people, it's education, Medicaid, and then mental health benefits. That said, here we said currently health insurance and Medicaid cover mental health preventive screenings for parents and children. Do you agree or disagree that the service should, if they were offered both at the same time? And again, this is a core value. I mean, I'd like to know the 6% who strongly disagree with this. It's like they must have thought it was a trick question, right? Because like, why, this is so common sense, and the public overwhelmingly say, yeah, I'm completely in favor of this. So, 3 things I want to leave you with. 1, there is complete bipartisan belief, and Vince will speak to this more, around these issues. 2, it's not even common sense to the public, which it is total common sense to the public. Many of these issues are core values now. 3, there is a very strong anti-government, anti-political feeling out there, and these issues can actually tap into that with feelings that people have about the need for reform. These are common sense reforms that make sense to people. These are things that people are willing to pay more taxes for when they think they don't have any money to pay more taxes, and these are things that people think will be more effective and save money in the long run. So it's a home run agenda, and an agenda where we see an unbelievable disconnect between Beltway thinking and real people thinking. So let me turn it over to Vince.
Vince, are you comfortable?
I'm fine, sure.
So let me give you the
Thank you.
Well, you know what? I can't see the screens all that well, so
Can you see this one?
yeah, I can see that one.
So you'll just ask.
I'll just ask. The last time Celinda and I worked together, it was on a subject which was a lot more depressing than this. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that's true.
We were looking at child protective services right after 2 kids had been murdered by somebody in the family, and it was as depressing and ugly as you could possibly get. This is a heck of a lot better, so I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to be talking about this subject. I'm here not because I'm going to give you survey data. Celinda has always done that in such a masterful way. I really don't have anything to add to what she said except show my first slide and say amen to everything that she has pointed out in the data that she collected post-election. Remember, these are voters, if you will, or at least they claim to be voters.
2014 voters.
Yeah. And that's an important distinction from from often what you see in public opinion polling. I'm here rather to take you on another kind of tour of this data, a tour directed towards communication strategy and what you say to which audiences, which in point of fact will probably be really key in getting some of those recalcitrant state legislatures and federal legislators to pay attention to your message. And we're going to do this by applying a technique which has now become known as data analytics. Here's an aside. I heard in the morning session several comment on finding really good jobs that'll give a living wage once they're through college. Well, if you want one that really will start at 6 figures plus with a 4-year degree, data analytics is it. So recommend it to your kids. All right, let's move on to the third slide. Well, no, go back. The second slide. What is segmentation? One of the data analytic procedures is called segmentation or cluster analysis. So what is it? Well, basically, the question that it asks of the data that's been collected, and in this case, Celinda's data, which has some excellent properties that make us all feel good about 2Gen, that's the data source we're asking, do birds of a feather flock together? That is, do people manifest similar patterns of response across all of these 13 items that Celinda just went through quickly for you in terms of the survey findings? And the answer to that question is, frankly, yes, they do. You can actually take these audiences and cluster them into groups or segments which share common attitudes across all of these questions. Now, as Celinda has already pointed out, that's a kind of a no-brainer because there's such unanimity in the support across all of these questions that you would just assume that, there's going to be a lot of common feeling among the audience of voters. Well, yes, there is a good deal of it, but it isn't quite as unanimous as you might guess. So let's go to the next slide. When you apply the segmentation technique to the questions which were in this study, you actually get out 3 separate audiences, which, and I'm sure all of you in this audience are familiar with the communication strategy equation, which is who says what to whom, under what circumstances, and through what modality. What we're going to be talking about is 2 parts of that communication equation, the says what and the who, the content and the audience. And we used all 13 questions that Celinda has reviewed in this analysis, and we discovered the following. So if you'll go to the next slide, you can actually create 3 separate audiences. And when I say separate, I'm talking statistically separate. That is, there's less than a 5% chance that those in audience 1 are like those in audience 2 or audience 3. The first audience we call 2Gen embracers because they truly do embrace every concept of the 13 concepts on 2Generation that were tested. They are your core group, if you will. There's a second group who are also very supportive of the majority of the statements that were given to them. But on a minority of those statements, they have some pretty strong disagreements. We call those folks subdued supporters. That is, basically, they are supportive. And they'll be part of that 65 or 70%, that figure that Celinda used repeatedly when talking about these various items of 2Gen programs. But they have some reservations. And here's where the rub comes. They will be the people you're going to have to do a lot more to convince to get on board fully from a political perspective for your agenda. Let's go to the next slide. Just in case you recognize that pie chart is really a synthetic creation of some graphic artist, and you really question whether you can put these interviews into groups which are homogeneous internally and heterogeneous when you look at a comparison between the other groups. That's what the actual data looks like. All interviews are represented in that chart. The heavy colored blue represents your solid core of support. The green are the supporters with some questions, and then the lighter color that trails off to the right, that's the audience of people who you're going to really have a difficult time convincing under any circumstances. Let's go to the next chart. When you look at how these audiences differ, you can see in this chart the specific ways in which the two-gen embracers manifest themselves. They show strong support across all 13 questions. They're bipartisan, but clearly more Democratic than Republican. They are slightly younger and slightly more likely to contain people of color or other minorities. This is a definition of a more Democratic audience, typically. What about the subdue supporters? Not too surprising for those of you in this group. That's a supportive group, but it is a Republican audience, and quite clearly a more Republican audience. It is as Republican as the first audience is Democratic. So you're getting a bifurcation along party lines. Again, no surprise in this rather toxic political environment, but clearly that group of subdued supporters is on board with most of what the two-generation argument should be. All right, let's go to the next chart. I'm not even going to talk about the last group because, quite frankly, it's a waste of your time and energy to try to do anything with them.
And it's small.
And it's small, yeah, and it's very small. Okay, let's look at this chart, which basically makes a comparison of the questions which deal with children and two-generation programs. I have tried to highlight where the audience of subdued support differs from the audience of your total core, and by putting a light shaded color, purple color. Now you're going to suffer eye strain if you try to read that, and I apologize. I don't know if you'll have copies of this or not, but again, something I heard several times in the presentations this morning, words count. So it's important to read these statements and contemplate what might be driving the differences between the core and the subdued support, and how you might address that in a more attractive way for the subdued support. Let's go to the next chart. So you can see there are 3 items there that the subdued support have some concern about. This chart shows all of the items that were asked about higher education and two-generation programs. Note immediately, there are no shaded areas on that chart. There are only clear boxes showing that comparison between Group 1 and Group 2. If you're going to start a conversation with a Republican, you start with two-generation and higher education. That's your safest ground for beginning any conversation with the group of subdued support. Oh, and by the way, it's also a winner with your core audience. So you're doing 2 things. You're entering the subject matter from a perspective where you can not offend and probably bring more on board those who might have questions, and you're reinforcing your core. That's a twofer in any man's book, and that's terrific from a strategic perspective. Okay, let's go to the next chart. This one shows one of the boxes that has a problem for those who are in the subdued support group, and that has to do with economic supports and human services. So again, you wouldn't want to take that topic and start your conversation either. You're on very solid ground if you started on health and well-being, which we talked about, I understand, more yesterday and some this morning. So that kind of gives you a feeling there. I'm going to go through the next quite quickly. Show the next slide because it's important, and I want to make a point here. 52% of the entire sample says, if we're going to treat people as people, common sense says you got to have parents and you got to have kids and you got to treat them together, okay? If you look at your audience of core support, 2 out of 3 of your audience of core support believes that. Look at the audience of subdued support. It drops to 40% who believe that. In other words, you actually have a majority who would approach the treatment by looking at parents first, give it to the parents, help the parents, they'll take care of the kids, or children first, or we don't really need any new programs. Immediately, that ought to tell you you've got, in terms of bringing on side that group of supporters, you've got to address some of the concerns that are causing them problem. I would also point out one other thing. in your core audience, it's only 66% who buy into the two-gen notion. So you still have a group of people, even among your core base of support, who have to be informed, brought on board, engaged more fully in the discussion of the two-generation program. They're all on side. We know that from the way they answer the questions. You just have to get them engaged. And that's a separate task in terms of communication strategy that you have to address in your own particular ways. Okay, let's skip quickly because I don't want to bore you with all this other stuff, but let's go to the slide on message tips and talk about that so we can leave most of the time for questions. Bipartisan analysis message tip. There we go. I just mentioned that even among your two-generation supporters, you have to keep them engaged and you have to renew or at least energize the engagement of a good portion of that group that hasn't really embraced fully, even though they're all on side in terms of the policy tests that we did, they're on side with two-generation. They just haven't engaged in it fully and grasped the entire concept. So you have to reach out to them. The next one, the message tips on a bipartisan basis. When you're going to engage the subdued support, we talked about this audience being more likely to support either parent-focused or child-focused programs rather than the two-generation program itself. So you're going to have to start where there is common ground. And the common ground exists, as you will see, under the messages most likely to appeal. So that's the next slide. Those messages most likely to appeal to the subdued support are all listed here. One of them comes out of the list of those messages which focus on children and two-generation programs. Three of them focus on education, and one focuses on health and well-being. Those are the places that you might want to consider starting your dialogue with this particular audience. On the other hand, things you really want to avoid and things that you should question in your own mind of why they are that way are the messages that basically cause dissonance with that subdued support group. What is it in these messages that really gives them some heartburn? Well, you each have to make your own analysis for that, and it really, to find a definitive answer, will require some qualitative work, which Celinda and others are, really super good at. But when I went through it, it occurred to me that most of the items on the things to avoid have to do with changes in the way the finances are handled when you are addressing these audiences of parents and children together. If you change the finances, either by changing the eligibility or by increasing the benefits, what you do is you tend to push that audience of subdued support in the wrong direction. So again, you don't want to start there. You want to start where you've got basic levels of agreement. Okay, let's go to the last slide, and then I'll shut up. There are opportunities in this data, even though it's overwhelmingly positive and bipartisan and reflects a common sense electorate, which thank God we have. There are opportunities here. First of all, I hope we can simplify some of these complexities, at least as I read through the questions that were tested. Some of them are just awfully complex.
That's true.
And we need to get some simplification going in our behalf. We also need to listen to and understand better the why nots. The arguments on two-generation programs really haven't started yet. We're looking at an audience out there who basically can see the good. They quite frankly haven't heard the bad, if there is bad. And I'm not saying that to be someone to dump water on the party, but there will be a pushback at some point in time. We haven't seen it yet. We need to find out what it's going to be. I would suggest you got to look at financing, because that's a very, in my mind at least, obvious component of why the subdued supporters are not fully on board yet, okay? So keep that in mind, and we need to take those arguments and get them into the testing mix so that they can be juxtaposed against the very positive findings that we have across the board on many of the policies changes that would be needed to make 2Gen really a national initiative. And then lastly, we need to consider why two arguments. Why should we really do this? One of them, tied to finances, is efficiency. It has to be more efficient to treat the family than it is to treat two individuals as entities standing alone when we know they don't. And I would hope that that could be an area that's probed and examined from the perspective of the two-generation folks here at Ascend. And I'm going to shut up.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince. Okay, now it's your turn. What are your questions? I have a lot, and I could spend all of the rest of this time asking my questions. But if you have questions, please raise your hand. Let's get some dialogue going. Yes. Oh, absolutely. We will make this available to Vince's PowerPoint as well as Celinda's. But what you have in the packets are the messaging tips, and some of that messaging is incorporated there. Questions? Okay, I've got one. So Celinda, this polling was done as exit polling in 2014. Have you seen anything in the last several months that you think we should be thinking about or considering? I mean, we're starting this new election cycle. What's your advice to us?
So three things, and Vince alluded to one of them, which is that the 2014 electorate is more conservative than the 2016 electorate. The 2016 electorate is going to be younger, bringing in a lot of young parents, the so-called rising American electorate, a lot more people of color. Notice on Vince's cluster analysis, he said of the strong supporters, you may have noticed that point, that he said African Americans and Latinos among the strongest and the strong supporters. So you're looking at an electorate that's even more in favor of this. So it's time to engage this conversation. The second thing that we know is that this is, frankly, a perfect agenda on, both, and I won't speak so much to the Republican side, I'll let Vince speak to that, but I think on both the Republican and the Democratic side, you have candidates who are very engaged on these issues. Certainly in Hillary Clinton, you have a lifelong history on children's issues. So I think it's very, very interesting to think about how to infuse in that campaign a conversation around these issues, because I would think that you would have a very receptive audience. You have in Jeb Bush, and there may be others as well, these governors, some of them have been very involved in these programs. So I would think on both sides, this is a conversation that you could get going that is a bipartisan conversation. This is not a polarizing conversation. The third thing I think is that as we've come out of the immediacy of the recession, people are no longer as worried about tomorrow losing their home or tomorrow losing their job. But they have become, and I think one of the frustrations that the Obama administration has felt, why isn't everybody happy? Well, everybody's not happy because it's a long way back and people feel stuck. And we have record numbers of people who think the next generation will be worse off. So it is a very interesting time when you're not under the threat of that immediacy. I don't have a dime to spend. I don't have a job. I could lose my house tomorrow. But more, let's think about where we're headed as a country. How do we get back on our feet? How do we have, I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking to myself when I came into this room, so really interesting, because three of the best testing words, if I were going to run Vince for president, or Margie for president, we should run Margie. We're going to work bipartisanly on it. If we were going to run Margie for president, three of the best testing words out there are resilience, integrity, and accountability. Wow. Wow. I thought really interesting that you are embedded in a values conversation that is actually one of the most strongest conversations to be had out there, independent of what candidate we were running. So I think it's really the time. And the question is how you have a day job already in your work. You have a night job fighting in the state legislature to hold on to your programs. Now I'm giving you an after midnight job, which is how do we infuse this into the presidential debate? Because I think it's the time.
Great. Vince, your thoughts?
Well, let me just add and say amen to what Celinda said. I agree with everything. There is a great opportunity from a bipartisan perspective in the political sphere. There's also an opportunity out there, at least if my anecdotal experience is any indicator, that the private sector is ready to engage in this area like it has never been before, at least in my lifetime, and Jesus, much too long. But
I hope it keeps on.
yeah, there is a desire for something that's kind of a combination of social action and capitalism. And example, large publishing house, which is not doing well right at the moment, like all publishing houses, because of the intrusion of the internet and piratisation and all that kind of stuff, has made a deal to take a reduced fee for a purchase of books, which can go right into community action programs for children in both preschool and early schooling at a huge savings, because the marketplace set up is a socially conscious marketplace, giving these into the system at this very reduced rate. But the benefit to the publisher is they buy the first lot, which covers their basic cost. So the risk from a profit perspective to the publisher goes way down. They're going to make money even if they only sell 500 copies instead of the 5,000 that they would have to sell in order to cover their basic costs. So there are ways that the private sector is and we heard Annie talk about them earlier this morning in terms of loans to those who are engaged in this effort. So lots of change going on out there, which is really positive.
Great, thank you. Questions? Yes. Hold on, we're getting a mic. Thank you.
I'm Lynn Applebaum from Education Alliance in New York, and I'm wondering if you have a history lesson on anything that's polled similarly or less favorably that actually led to change in policy or legislation at the federal or state level. Like, is there a blueprint we can follow with this?
Isn't that an interesting question? Because I'll tell you what's interesting about it. There are lots of historical parallels in polling data, but that is layered over what I would call an ahistorical situation politically. So that the public is so far ahead of the elected leaders. And you've got the Tea Party faction of the Republicans, and again, I'll let Vince speak to this more, he knows it better than I do, really opposed to this. And you have, frankly, Democrats intimidated on it. They would not believe this agenda is as popular as it is. They would not run on this agenda today. They would think, oh, I'm going to be accused of big spender and welfare and poor people and not middle class, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't have in my head an example of the polling data being so far ahead of the political situation. I'm having trouble thinking of an analogy, honestly, for that reason.
What do we do? Right, like, we've got this groundswell. I'm not running. Marjorie's running.
Right, I'm running. What do? I
That
hire
was just- I was
Celinda
saying-
to do
right.
some more polling
There you
for
go.
around messaging.
Well, what Ascend has to do is it has to make this an issue relevant in the primaries. If you wait till the end, it'll be too late. But if you can make the issue relevant in the primaries, and certainly on both sides, there's
Yeah.
going to be some interesting debates in the primaries.
That's right.
If you can make it relevant in the primaries, you're going to elevate the level of this issue into the general election. You get it into the general election, and you're going to force a level of bipartisan agreement on this issue because of these numbers. But I have to tell you, I have seen polling data this optimistic or this positive or this one directional that went absolutely nowhere. But it was some time ago in a study of education primarily looking at kids who were 1 year or more behind grade level, and what does it take to advance them. We, along with the System Development Corporation, we did a national longitudinal study over a 3-year period, and then analyzed the data, saying, okay, what are the predictors? What will increase and get kids from their current depressed state up to grade level in that period of time? And there was only one consistent predictor, which everybody agreed upon, and which was mentioned again today as a significant factor, and we haven't solved it yet, and that's the involvement of the father in giving homework instruction to their kids.
Wow.
The only one, and that was 30 years ago,
Wow.
and we have not managed to do much about it. So, you know, moving this country and the opinion, the political will to bring about changes that are really effectual, I may be a little pessimistic on that end.
So I think there are 3 things I might do, but I share Vince's pessimism. One, I would just add on and tag on to his.
You will not be called on again.
Yeah, there you go. Bad question, bad question. You know, if the presidential's adopted, you'll get a lot of adoption by candidates running underneath the president on both sides. So if Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton, I don't even know who the Republican nominee will be, but I know that Jeb Bush has spoken on these issues. If they adopted it, other ones would say, I mean, politicians are an incredibly risk-averse lot right now. And they don't want to be the first. They don't want to be courageous. And I think one could make the argument to the presidential candidates in both campaigns that this is an enormous advantage to them. You know, you've got a Republican Party, for example, that wants to target Latino voters aggressively. And I think they really sincerely mean it, and Vince is an expert in that on the Republican side. He can speak to this. Well, here's an issue. You want to target Latino voters? Here's an issue to do it. You know, you've got a candidate on the Democratic side who wants to mobilize record numbers of women voters. You want to mobilize record numbers of women voters? Here's how you do it. The second thing I would just do is underscore what Vince said is I don't know that the leadership is going to come from the political sector. I think the leadership may come from non-political sectors. Yeah. So businesses who I think are prepared to be record gun-ho on this stuff. Businesses are also donors to candidates. Businesses were the ones decades ago, and Vince was part of this effort, so he knows more about it than I do. When the original Bush, George Bush Sr., launched the education initiative. Now, we may have different views about that or whatever, but it was a major national platform with some real stuff behind it. So I think the stuff may come more from the non-political sector. The 2 other interesting audiences, I think, in that regard are mayors and governors. We're going to have a record number of gubernatorial elections in 2018. Getting this implanted in those debates early on. And governors on both sides of the aisles are pretty moderate because they have to deliver. They can't just have positions. They have to actually balance their budgets. They have to get shit done. One of my favorite candidates for governor was Governor Wise from West Virginia, who's very involved in these issues, as many of you probably work with him. And he used to describe the difference between he had been a 20-year congressman. And he said, you know, when somebody came to me when I was a congressman and they said, you know, it's snowing outside, Congressman. He goes, yeah, you know, an Eskimo has 20 words for snow, and there are 3 different kinds of crystals that make up snow, and blah, 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 blah. We should have a commission on snow. He said, when I was governor of West Virginia and somebody came to me and said, Governor, it's snowing outside, he goes, yeah, I called out the trucks 2 hours ago. It's a totally different mentality in those offices. Mayors are an incredible, ambitious, and innovative lot right now. I think on both sides of the aisles we have a set of quality mayors that is unique in our times. And figuring out, is there a way, is there a connection? What is the mayoral agenda? So you don't have to get it passed by the right-wing legislator of either party from Timbuktu. And I was born and raised in Timbuktu, Montana. But you don't have to get them on board. How can we use these cities? And how can we use the current dialogue that's going on about what's going on in our cities to really move these issues? So again, I think that may be a way around. So get it adopted at the national by the presidentials, and that means really organizing in 4 states right now. Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada. 2, organize the other voices and make sure those voices take it to the campaigns, both as donors and as advocates. And 3, think about a long-term strategy that includes the governors and mayors.
Yeah. Celinda, I'm so glad that you ended on that optimism, where the opportunity is, because...
Except everybody else is looking exhausted.
Well, I know. It's after lunch. Snap your fingers. But the reason why we're having this session is because Ascen's role is to provide this information to our network, to our stakeholders, to the people who have the capacity to do something about this, right? If the game is at the state and local level, these are the tools. This is how you can message this information, you know, as you're doing your work. You believe in this. You believe in these strategies. You're doing the great work. So how do you talk about it to the people that have control over resources, whether or not they be businesses or elected officials? So I'm going to call on someone, not over here, but over here. Okay, good. Shelley's got a question. You want to call on somebody? Well, let's have your question, but Jennifer, no, I'm calling on you. Okay. You see?
I'm saving you. I'll ask a really long question.
I have a question for Jennifer.
I have 3-part question. And I've asked you this before, but I'm struck, Celinda, with the previous research you did on the term 2Gen, which actually was harder to get these kind of polling numbers. And as somebody who gives speeches on 2Gen a lot, I feel like I spend 10 of my 12 minutes describing what I mean.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the fact that when you describe it in the policy context, we get such better take-up. And what would be your advice about how hard we work on articulating what we mean through the policy framework versus trying to define 2Gen itself, and kind of where has your thinking evolved around that particular conundrum? Because I really do, and I hear it from everybody. We hate that term. It's like, I know, I hate it too, but there's no better one.
Well,
But it's better than other terms.
It's better than everything else, right?
Yeah, I think there is a better one, actually, and it was pretty revealed to in the clustering that Vince did, which is parent and child, parent and child. It also gets, one of the things about 2Gen is people have a sneaking suspicion, and early on, we were saying mother and child, and people go, where are the dads? So I think that, I think parent-child is frankly the better way to go. And we feel like we need this label, 2Gen. I'm not sure that we do. And I think it's an interesting question, but I don't know that we need to label it particularly. It was a sexy name, but unfortunately, you know, we just tested it again for a whole different client in another setting, and people thought 2Gen was solar panels on your roof. I mean, people think that 2Gen is two ways to generate power for my home. So I think this term is actually deteriorating over time, to be honest with you. Now, it may be getting clear because we're using it more. People also, you know, we got the whole pushback of, what about 3Gen? What about the grandparents? And in the Latino community, that was really salient. So I just think families and children, parents and children, I have become convinced we don't need a label. I don't understand why we are, and Marjorie and Ann may be mad at me for this, and Sarah, but I'm just not sure it's worth it.
I have a lot to say about that, but I won't right
Please do, please do.
Well,
just summarize it.
Well, we talk about 2Gen as being an approach, right?
Yeah.
It's not a program, it is an approach. It's how you think differently about serving families. So it opens up, 2Gen opens up a conversation that was not happening before. And we understand that, you know, 2Generation, that term has been used before, but look at all the new people that are engaged in this conversation that weren't before, that are thinking differently. So I think that, you know, for Ascend and our goal to create a new conversation about how you know, disrupt poverty and talk about, you know, families differently and the opportunities, I think, you know, that goal is being accomplished.
And maybe one of the things, I think the lesson is, because, you know, speaking, I'm very sympathetic to what you said, and I didn't mean to cut you off, Marjorie, but maybe the point is don't pause. Like when you're planning your breath, don't take a breath after 2Gen. get it defined and then pause. So I think we're a lot less trouble when we say two-generation new approach to poverty that includes parents and children. Okay, take the breath then. Don't take it at two-gen approach. And people go, okay, well,
That's
I like
helpful.
solar, but what's that got to do with it?
Okay, so I one more question, but I promised I would ask Jennifer, right? So Jennifer, you work at the National Governors Association. You have lived in the world of Head Start for a long time. I understand you wrote your dissertation on
wow.
these strategies and approaches. Given what you've heard in the conversation, what are your thoughts or questions around how to, talk to governors about this work? Because most of us are interested in working at the state and local level.
Yeah, so I think, one of you made the point that I think efficiency in operations and in government program, one of the challenges I see is governors are very focused, particularly in this economic climate, on the economy. And economy and jobs and workforce get attention and get conversations. No matter what conversation I've found I've been in with governors and their senior advisors, it has turned into conversations about workforce. And one of the things that worried me a little bit was every question that had workforce type language in it got the biggest distinction between your groups. And I couldn't tell how much that was the higher ed questions sound more like career counseling, which is a cheaper thing to do versus, so I was struggling with what was between it, but I sort of felt like that's one of the angles in that I see. And I worry about what I'm seeing in that polling and how you make that work. But I do think this issue of better government, more effective, I've been just struck by the number of governors who've really laid out state level outcomes that they want for people in their states. And it's not this program and that program and this program and that program. It's we want families who are economically prosperous. We want healthy communities. They are these big picture outcomes. And I think focusing on that and using those to manage states allows you to start saying, well, why are these silos causing us to serve people so separately? Yeah. So that's another angle in, and I do think it gets to this sort of efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability of government for actually getting outcomes, not just implementing programs. So that would be my thoughts on the issue.
That's very, very helpful. Vince.
It's interesting
Final
that you said that. In the corporate world, it used to be kind of the standard that if you're going to fulfill your duty to the community, you sent your workforce down to the soup kitchen and they served a meal. Or you took them out to an area that was a little barren and they planted trees. And they would do this maybe 2 or 3 or 4 times during the course of the year, and you could look at yourself and say, wow, aren't we wonderful? That's changed. That has significantly changed. Corporate CEOs are now much more willing to engage in the intractable problems of poverty, environmental degradation, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a fundamental change in the mindset, if you will, in the private world, and I think that's a very positive thing. But in talking to your world, y'all are going to have to know that profit isn't a 6-letter bad word, because they're going to be looking for ways in which they can serve on those intractable problems, but they don't want to do it by simply forking out money. Quite frankly, most CEOs will make an argument something like this. We've already spent $30 trillion since the war on poverty, and we're still fighting the same battles. Money is not the answer. And they got a point. And if you can figure out a cooperative method in your partnership so that you can get a quasi-capitalistic perspective on it, you got a winner. And it will really attract a great deal of attention politically, because lots of politicians on both sides of the aisle are looking for those kinds of solutions.
Celinda, any final comments on your end?
Well, one thing I think is that one of the things we need to change is to message. We message right now on contingent. If you guys are good guys, you would do this, rather than messaging from inevitability. And I think what we need to do is shift the frame here and message from inevitability. One of the things, we do a lot of work with AFT, and I love Randy Weingartner in this respect, because she frequently does that. And, you know, there are these raging battles in education right now. Are we going to provide these peripheral services, blah, 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 blah. And the public's wildly in favor of all of these things. And frankly, the public would solve everything with the schools if they could, because it's a public entree point that they can figure out. That said, and I think actually, Jennifer, one of the things with workforce is I think people are a little torn, particularly Republicans, about, well, is this a public responsibility or a private responsibility? Like, you know, there's all kinds of training in the, why do the companies train whatever kind of workforce they want? But that said, in 6 years, in 5 to 6 years, half of every kindergarten class in America is going to be the children of single moms. We cannot put those kids back in utero. That is inevitable. Therefore, a whole ton of debates that we're having right now are nonsensical. After-school programs, transportation services, school nurses, wraparound services. If you've got half of the kids in there, the kids of single parents, those aren't even questions anymore. Of course we have to have those things. And so I think one of the things we need to do as we're on the cusp of major change in our country and coming back out of this recession is to measure, to message not from contingency or if you were nice or you should do this, but from inevitability. And I think that's a big piece of the change we need.
That's really helpful. One last question. Yes.
So one of the other inevitabilities, and I'll just play devil's advocate here, is that we don't fund things in isolation, and we have the baby boomers, we have the elders,
Yeah,
we know much more significant increase in the over 65
That's
with
right.
a lot of diseases that are going to frankly eat up a lot of the budgets of both the
That's right.
states and families, and then we have decline in birth rate for young kids. So how do we convince people that we should continue or increase investments in the young, whose numbers are going down,
yeah.
and not transfer some of those resources to the old, who could potentially bankrupt all of us?
Right. It's a really good point. And if I can add to that, too, unfortunately, the young and the parents of the young increasingly don't vote, and those seniors vote like crazy. So if you're a politician, all you care about is self-preservation at this point. There's no question about who you're going to be listening to. And in fact, it used to be that having a child increased your participation. Now having a child actually decreases your participation. And we can talk a lot of reasons why that is. So I think it's a very important point. And I would say and you know, frankly, it's a great question that you're asking, and we haven't been able to get anybody to really focus on this. I have thought for a long time, and we were hoping, you know, the seniors, I was hoping that the baby boomer seniors would be more progressive on these issues. They are not. The seniors are, these baby boomer seniors are starting to look as conservative or more conservative, because many of them are Reagan seniors, than the Roosevelt seniors did, even though they have more responsibility for kids and everything else, and more involved in their grandkids' lives. So I think we need a major seniors project and partnership. And obviously ARP is an obvious partner for this, or somebody, but we need a messaging project about how to get to seniors, because as long as seniors see this as us versus them, I know which us is going to win, and it's not going to be the kids, honestly. And so I think it's very, very, you're raising a really critical point.
So thank you, Celinda. So Ascend is committed to this work, polling, focus groups, providing this type of information for the field and for the network, because we think it's very important that you have tools to engage, you know, with your communities, your stakeholders, business, elected officials. So expect to see Vince and Celinda again with fresh information
Hopefully.
and new messages, and just join me in thanking them for this session. So we have about a 5-minute break.